I am Garth Barengi, and this is my dark place. Good evening, and just kidding, of course. Welcome to Stygian Articles, presented by the Lovecraft Tapes podcast. I am Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore, and tonight I'm going to try something a bit different. We have a couple weeks break from recording new play sessions for the podcast, so I thought it might be fun to read you some scary stories. Hello, everybody in the chat. T-Flipper-X, Beyond Peril, Justin, Obsidian Phoenix, Merengue Pie, you know it. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that show, but it's pretty awesome. All right. Full disclosure, I have never really attempted narration of written fiction other than what you hear on the podcast. So I'm bound to slip up here and there, mispronounce some words, maybe even pause for a drink every now and again. I'm hoping you'll humor me and that you can extract some kind of enjoyment out of this experiment. If it all goes well and you like this new segment, I may produce more Stygian articles in the future. Please note, listener discretion is advised. The scary stories I read and write will sometimes contain extreme horror, violence, language, and other adult themes, so watch and listen at your own risk. Tonight, I think we're pretty safe. I've chosen two tales that aren't that extreme, so. All right, let's do this. With that, we begin our first tale, The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft. That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests with shade and form, of witch and demon and large coffin worm, were long benighted. Keats. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I am strangely content and cling desperately to those sere memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strewed away some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in many of the moldy books. From such books I learned that all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark, mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape the forest, but as I went farther from the castle, the shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest and into the unknown outer sky. And at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding a day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that deed. Sorry. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress. For climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill as of haunted and venerable mold assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure that I might peer out and above, and try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trap door of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower, no doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, but hoped when necessary it would but hoped when necessary to pry it open again. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky and the moon and stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shells of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment so many eons cut off from the castle below. Then unexpectedly my hands came upon a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known. For shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway, was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams and in vague visions I dare not call memories. Fancying now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door. But the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me on the level through the grating nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church, whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch out of that region of slabs and columns and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where only occasional ruin bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic, several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved toward one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation, the putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesomeness revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror, I saw it. I saw in its eaten away and bone revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape, and in its sorry, and in its moldy, disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much so to make a feeble effort toward flight. A backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred and shewed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accidents, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle in the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos there is balm as well as bitterness, and that balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the trap door immovable, but I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle and the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nephron Ka in the sealed and unholy valley of Hadoth by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save the unnamed feasts of Nicotis. Sorry, I got to screw that one up. Nor any gaiety save the unnamed feasts of Nitocris beneath the great pyramid. Yet, in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For, although nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass. All right. That is it for H.P. Lovecraft's The Outsider. I hope you enjoyed that. I flubbed a couple of lines here and there, but didn't go too badly. Yeah. So, we're all a bit more sophisticated these days, but when I read this back when I was a teenager, I was shocked at that ending. It actually caught me by surprise. We're talking many, many decades ago. Um, but I've always sort of liked this tale, and we've seen this played out again and again in zombie movies and other horror films. Where, I mean, even to a certain extent, The Sixth Sense is a manifestation of this story. And so, in current days, it can come off as a bit hoary, a bit long in the tooth, a bit cliche almost. But I still really like the way that Lovecraft uses his flowery language, purple prose, to weave this tale of a city beneath the earth. Essentially, the main character was dead all along, was a corpse, and is unaware of it or has forgotten about dying, which is even creepier. I also really like the idea. I believe there's another short story where the protagonist is trapped in a space where it's surrounded by his ancestors and their books, and there's just nobody else there except for those materials and kicking around. And when I was a teenager, you at that age you tend to think of yourself as a bit of a loner, and nobody understands me and that sort of thing. So this fit right in. So okay, that's the first one down, and we're going to switch gears and read a story that I wrote. And then I'll tell you an even scarier story after that. That isn't fiction. All right. Here we go. This is called Broken Spokes by me. Driving at night sucked. The poker game at Tom's had gone long, and now Jim had 30 miles in front of him at just past midnight. Beyond the windshield, the cracked two-lane unraveled slowly. He longed to be home already, tucked inside his warm bed beside his warm wife, spooning on their flannel sheets. Soon enough, he thought. The second place cash in his pocket made him smile. Monday, he could crow about it to his coworkers, how his pocket queens got cracked by pocket tens. Just another sad poker story, but at least he finished in the cash. Meatloaf crooned on the radio. Jim tapped his fingers on the steering wheel and hummed under his breath. He felt pretty good. Probably shouldn't have had that last beer. Though he didn't feel drunk, a light aura of contentment enveloped him. The yellow dashes between the lanes flickered by like dead echoes of Morse code. He didn't see the bicyclist until it was too late. Jesus fuck! He screamed and slammed on the brakes. The truck squealed in protest. His wheels locked and skidded toward the static tableau of a young man halfway across the road, gaping in wonder at the vehicle bearing down upon him. Jim pumped the brakes frantically, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were a life preserver. His eyes bugged. His teeth ground together. He prepared for impact. When it came, the whole scene slowed, every microsecond preserved for him to observe in excruciating detail. The front of the truck impacting with the rider. The young man launching himself upward out of his seat to avoid having his leg pinned between the bumper and the bike frame. The grinding crash of the pedals meshing with the metal grill. The rider rolls up onto the hood of the truck, leaving a dent, and continues to hurtle toward the windshield. And then momentum ceases. The brakes do their job. Time spits everything back out in reverse. Both the bike and the rider are launched forward into the road about 20 feet from the front of the idling truck. Fuck! Jim yells again and puts it in park. His hands are shaking badly, nerves taut like bowstrings. For a minute, he can't find the door handle to get out. When he does, he stands unsteadily on the concrete. He has to lean against the truck for a moment, wondering if he'll be sick. The feeling passes, and he stumbles to the still, prone man illuminated by the headlights. Jim is sure the man is dead. As he nears, though, the rider stirs. Don't move, he says. You're hurt. He can see now the young man is probably in his late 20s, dark complexion with a ghost of a goatee. Medium build, dressed in jean shorts and printed t-shirt depicting a well-endowed chihuahua. Above the dog's head hung a cartoon bubble containing the words, Yo quiero this. The rider stood up anyway. He shook his head and seemed dazed. Jim watched him nervously, expecting any moment to see blood blossom on the shirt or begin streaming from numerous cuts and scrapes. For some reason, he thought about the time when he was 13. He and some friends were walking downtown heading to a movie. They came across an old hubcap lying on the road. He picked it up and tossed it like a frisbee, showing off to his buddies. As it left his hand, the rusty metal disc tore a strip of skin off his thumb. He stared at his hand for what seemed like a full minute before the blood finally welled to the surface of the deep cut. During that minute, He'd always wondered what his body had been thinking while it prepared to send plasma to the damaged area. I think I'm okay, said the writer. To his surprise, Jim didn't see any blood erupting like geysers from the man's broken body. In fact, the young man didn't appear hurt in any way. He was walking around his twisted bicycle in wonder. Holy shit, he whispered. Jim nodded. The bike frame was bowed in the middle. The bike frame was bowed in the middle like a concave piece of art on display in some inner city gallery. The back tire bore a striking similarity to one of Dolly's melting clocks. Shards of plastic from the broken reflectors littered the road. How the young man escaped that transformation without being touched? Well, it approached something akin to miracle. Suddenly, Jim became nervous. He'd been drinking all night. If a cop happened along and gave him a breathalyzer test, it would be the end of his driving days for a while. Might even toss him in the clink. Well, if you're sure you're okay, he said, and got back into his still idling truck. The rider watched, his face hardening. Hey, man, what about my bike? Jim shrugged. You were in the middle of the road at night, for shit's sake. Next time you'll know better. He put the truck in drive. At least you weren't hurt. As he rolled away, he saw the young man in his rearview mirror flip him off, then turned to collect the mangled remains of his bicycle. Jim held his breath until he got around the next curve. His whole body trembled. No more late-night poker games, he told himself. No more drunk driving. The truck picked up speed. A couple miles from home, he thought he saw another cyclist just beyond the cone of his headlights. He was sure he saw the metallic glint of turning spokes. But it was nothing. Nothing but his overworked imagination. The next morning, he nearly choked on his bagel when he saw the headline in the regional section of the Sunday newspaper. Bicyclist killed by drunk driver. Jim swallowed hard. He read further. Sometime after midnight, Jacob Christopher, 27, of Grand Rapids, was struck and killed by a car driven by Troy Hyams, 19, of Rockford. According to police reports, Christopher had been riding his bicycle to steel manufacturing, where he worked third shift. Hyams was returning home after a house party when his SUV struck and killed Christopher. Hyams reportedly blew twice the legal limit during a routine breathalyzer test and was taken into custody. Family members were notified. He skimmed the remainder of the article, his face pounding with a mixture of embarrassment, relief, and guilt. Jacob Christopher. The young man's name had been Jacob. For some reason, Jim wished he'd known that last night. He folded the paper, finished his breakfast, and washed it down with a bitter cup of black coffee. Nobody knows, he thought. I'm off the hook. If I had left the poker game even 2 minutes later, Hyams still would have creamed Jacob's bike. Things would have turned out the same. For the rest of the day, he tried to shake the feeling that people were watching him. A little girl stared while he waited in line at the bookstore, her forehead creased as if deep in thought. Pedestrians seemed to inspect the dent in his hood as they passed by. At the grocery store, an old woman accidentally bumped into his cart and scowled at him with outrage. "Watch where you're going!" she shrieked. Everybody in the store looked at him. He mumbled an apology and practically ran away, his chest thumping, hands sweaty. He gave every bicyclist a wide berth on his way home, though it was full daylight. Each little noise in his apartment became the knock of the police. He sat in front of the television, watching nothing, drinking a beer but not tasting it. Soon, it was time for bed. Sometime past midnight, he awoke from a nightmare that he couldn't recall. A scream stopped cold in his throat, and the phantom echo of broken spokes rattling in his ears. For the next 3 months, Jim tried to forget what happened that night. The memory dissipated surprisingly fast. He fixed the dent. People stopped looking at him strangely, and the dreams went away. Life returned to normal. "Come on," said Tom. His words slurred together so they sounded like one. "We'll get another game going on in just a minute. You haven't played in so long." Jim shook his head. "No thanks, I gotta get home." It was true. His brother was coming in from Detroit tomorrow morning to help him move some stuff into storage. "Oh, sure. Take your winnings and run. I get it." Tom stumbled back to the poker table while Jim retrieved his coat. He bid everyone good night, then went out into the darkness. Although it was mild for a November evening, the gusting wind gave the air a wicked bite. He climbed into his truck, fumbling a little with the keys. How many beers had he drunk? 5? 6? A few, anyway. A warm pall enveloped his body. For just a moment, he thought about going inside and crashing on Tom's couch. He'd have to get up at dawn, race back home, shower, change, and then meet his brother. It could be done, but it would be inconvenient. Better to get home right now and be done with it. He could sleep in his own comfortable bed, cuddled under his own flannel sheets. Just the thought decided it for him. He cranked the engine, gave it gas, and headed toward home. The road stretched out ahead. The truck's headlights carved only a small portion of the blackness. Out here, street lamps were few and far between. It felt like he was swimming from buoy to buoy in a midnight sea. Slowly, a wave of deja vu swept over him. This was the spot, up ahead, where Jacob Christopher died. Unconsciously, Jim let up on the gas pedal. The truck's speed dropped until he rolled along at just under 30 miles an hour. He scanned the dark, expecting to see something, some kind of sign perhaps? A message from beyond exonerating him from guilt? He chuckled drunkenly. Yeah, right. Like the dead have time for forgiveness. Jim blinked away the bleariness creeping in at the corners of his vision. A single blink. Jacob Christopher appeared in the road, astride his bicycle, that same dismayed look of surprise on his face. Jim kicked both feet onto the brake pedal. Momentum surged forward while the truck tried to stop. Too late. Jacob slammed onto the hood, his neck snapping sideways with the impact, his body like a rag doll, rolling up against the windshield where his head smacked a spiderweb crack in the glass. Then he was gone, thrown back out onto the street. The truck shuddered to a stop. Jim peeled his whitened hands off the steering wheel and got out, trembling, with that familiar mixture of fear and adrenaline. The road was empty. He stared. No twisted body in the road, no wrecked bike, No debris. Nothing but empty concrete and oil stains. Jim looked at his truck. A fresh dent on the hood and grill. The newly formed crack in his windshield. None of that was his imagination. "You fucker!" he yelled into the night. "It's your fault, not mine." A forlorn wind soughing through the trees answered him. Shaking badly now, Jim climbed back into his truck. He put it in drive. Down the road, less than a quarter mile, Jacob waited for him again. Only instead of that innocent, shocked look, he now smiled smugly into the headlights. Jim floored it. "Take that, motherfucker!" he shrieked as the body struck his vehicle. More dents, more cracked glass. In his rearview mirror, nothing lay dead in the middle of the road. The truck hurled down the pavement. Suddenly, bicyclists were everywhere. 10 Jacob Christophers, 100, 1,000. The truck plowed through them until it sounded like driving through a hailstorm from hell. Jacob's twins leered at him through the spidery windshield. A multitude of bicycles bounced off the truck, aluminum screeching in death throes. But no blood. Never any blood. Jim leaned over the steering wheel, foot steady on the gas pedal. This wasn't his fault. He refused to take responsibility. After all, it had to end sometime, right? The truck continued to hurtle through the darkness, no longer on the road, no longer near any road on any map. Countless Jacob Christophers waited on their bikes, patient, grinning. A long, endless night of driving lay ahead. All right. That was Broken Spokes. I wrote that some time ago, based on two things that actually happened to me. One was I was living in Grand Rapids, and we were moving. We were purchasing a condo downtown, and we sold our house in Kentwood, but had to move to an apartment while the condo was being finished. Wait for it, Chiro. And we were basically shuttling what we could because it was only a couple miles between the house and the apartment where we were moving to. And so I would just load up my truck. I had a Pontiac Aztek at the time, and we would just shuttle over what we could and leave all the big stuff for the movers. But I took like my computer and things like that. And it was on one of the very last shuttles that I came to a stop, and it was essentially a entry onto a 2-lane, not really a highway, but a regional highway. And you turn right. It's only a one way, so you can only turn right. Well, a bicyclist was going the wrong way. So he was coming from my right when he should have been on the other side of the road entirely. And yeah, I think it was back in 2003. And I started going, did not see him, and tried to hit the brakes, but was a little too late and made full contact. He flew. I thought he was going to fly into traffic, into the 2-lane highway that they were going like, 70 miles an hour. Thankfully, he only got essentially nudged about 20 feet from the front of my car. I jumped out, went to him, I did mangle his bike. He did get scraped up a bit. And so after figuring out that he wasn't terribly hurt, I insisted taking him to a clinic down the road and loaded up his bike in the Aztec. Stayed with him at the clinic for a bit to make sure he was perfectly fine, which he was. He just had a couple scrapes, and we were both just nerves. And then I took him to a store and purchased him a new bike. This was a young man who was working. He was actually going to a factory job. And this is back when I worked at Grabber. Justin, you should know this story. And got him a new bike and dropped him off at his work and gave him my information and said, if there's any complications, let me know. But I never heard from him since, and that was that. The other part of the story is I did used to play poker at a friend's house that was not too far away from where we lived at the time, just a couple miles really. And I had a couple beers at this poker game and was thinking, okay, I better, taper off here and have some coffee or something. And it was snowing quite hard out. And suddenly we're sitting there playing poker and a police officer shows up at the door and he's like, hey, who owns that Toyota Corolla out there? And I was like, oh shit, what, did I leave it running or did I park wrong or whatever? He goes, yeah, the snow plow hit your car. I wasn't parked. He couldn't stop. The snowplow skidded through the stop sign and basically broadsided my Toyota Corolla. And so I had to go outside and do all the paperwork and all that stuff. And but you talk about sobering up real quick. So I finished the poker game and was actually able to get the Corolla back much later. And it still ran, but I had to get a lot of body work to it. But those two incidents sort of collided in my brain, and that's how I came up with this particular story. So anyways, I hope you guys like this. Let me know. I actually think, I'm going to be doing this again for sure next Wednesday. And I've already got one of the Lovecraft tales picked out. I'll be reading From Beyond. Very short story. And I'll choose something or write something for my segment as well. So anyways, that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. And I'm going to sign off. We will see you soon. We'll see you tomorrow night for some Double Vision. Have a great night. Thank you, everybody in the chat. Appreciate it. I'll see you later. I guess I actually have a little thing here at the end here. And that's it for tonight's Stygian Articles. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed these scary stories, please visit Stygian Articles. I always say Stygian Articles, but Stygian Articles for more of my dark fiction, and lovecrafttapes.com for fresh episodes of our Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast. I am Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore, wishing you a pleasant evening. Good